Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
All right, and we're back for another episode of Socializing Security. We are trying our best to weigh in on a current event at the moment. I think it's Brian's. You're excited about it, but I feel like it's not your favorite type of topic that we do. And why is that?
I mean, that seems to be the trend we're on lately, but yeah, I mean, we always talk about current events, of course, and current events can be very interesting and tell us things about what's going on and how to do security better. But current events also can be really tough to report on at the time, and making sure that it's accurate and that this episode isn't going to age out in 2 weeks because something new happens that makes this episode worthless to people to listen to later on. So it can be a little bit of challenging from that perspective. So I think we'll talk about the news and talk about the implications and what that might mean kind of in the broader context of things. So use current news to make points as to kind of what's going on, I think is going to be an interesting conversation.
Yes. So on that topic, we're talking about 23andMe. And really, they were in the news this past week now while we're recording of filing for bankruptcy. And we've spoken about this particular company on previous past episodes in the context of data privacy and data breaches. I believe on past episodes I've mentioned something about this being one of the better case studies for compliance professionals, law students, people who are learning about compliance, privacy, security to pay attention to. This, I think, is a breaking development in this case study, is what I'm going to say. Again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Context is really important when we talk about current events. You and I are not investigative journalists. We do this as a side hustle, as a fun thing. So, this is a hobby for us with this podcast. We're enjoying doing it. And we did have a couple, friends of the podcast reach out being like, hey, what am I supposed to do with my data? What am I supposed to do? So let's weigh in on it.
Given 23andMe, and we have talked about them and we're going to name them here, I kind of want to start with Milu, not necessarily asking if you have used such tests before, but with everything that's happened, would you still use them? Like if you were thinking about doing it and this thing happened, is this something that, well, maybe I'll go to a different company, but does this affect your decision to ever do genetic testing?
It absolutely does, and I think it should impact everybody's thoughts on it. I wish it didn't, because the initial background of why genetic testing, it was such a revolutionary technology, and it started right with the intention of connecting long lost relatives is a lot, and also learning a lot about our genetics and things that scientists and researchers could have never dreamed about knowing about human beings, which the intention behind it, incredible. And so from an innovation and as a technologist, absolutely love the technology, and I'm hopeful that other companies, especially around the world, can continue to use this technology safely. It just needs regulation around it before I'd feel comfortable using it. So I'd probably be more likely investing and researching into genetic testing companies that are based in Europe, for example, where they have the General Data Protection Regulation. GDPR is already significantly better protection for sensitive data, including personal health information, PHI, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it kind of proves why I've not ever done it. There have been, like you and I have talked about, the ability for genetic testing to highlight medications and food allergies and things like that actually have given me a use case that had been making me think about it, but then something like this happens and I'm like, nope, I don't need to know that bad. I'll go through and trial and error foods and figure out which ones bother me if that's what it takes.
Which is an option. There's certain things that for medications or something, it's really hard to trial and error different meds or something.
For sure.
So I would say I think it kind of is a similar thing where like your risk tolerance might just be different than mine, might just be different than my neighbors, might be different than my family's,
For sure.
right? This is like a constant thread that we've said of like data privacy, and privacy is one of my favorite areas of the law and regulation and compliance because there is not one size fits all. What works for one person might not work for another and might not work for another, which is why it's so hard to regulate. But
Yeah.
also, it's so important that we need to, because one person's risk tolerance might need to be very different because they're just like more vulnerable. They're just like a more like vulnerable person in terms of like what sensitive information somebody might have on them. And so they deserve enhanced protections to ensure that this material doesn't get in the wrong hands. And so I think when we talk about that, right, like we always talk about like doomsday and like worst case scenarios,
Yeah.
genetic material, especially samples. So I think because a lot of this is also like comes down to the actual sample, right, of how that could be used without somebody's consent is really scary. And so a company going through bankruptcy, such as, 23andMe, they could be selling off assets. And so that's what's a little bit scary about the genetic materials that they might have access to. Okay, we can talk about their databases and hopefully they're encrypted and secured and they're going to do what they're supposed to do, right? I'd be shocked if they weren't. And a lot of that is already regulated, right? Even in the US. But a lot of the like genetic samples and stuff like that, like it could become like a name your price scenario where it's just seen as an asset at the end of the day. And it could hopefully be anonymized, but maybe the sticker's not good enough or somehow it's traceable. We've just talked about this on our last episode. I think, Brian, you've got one coming out too about cyber espionage. We're thinking through, maybe if it is a genetic sample material and it is like a vial in a refrigerator,
Yeah.
who's getting access to that? Because that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's also, don't consider what the implications of your entire DNA map getting out today are. Like once it's in that database, if some of that data is already leaked, I think we'll talk about that here in a second. What can be done with that 20, 50 years from now? Like we're not at the point where we're cloning human beings today, but I kind of
Cloning
have no
dogs.
doubts. And I kind of have no doubts that no matter what society feels, we're going to end up in a place. We have the potential. Let me put it that way. There's real
Technology
potential.
exists, yes.
We could get there. And so, yeah, like I don't know that I want somebody breaching 23andMe today or in 2023, getting that information, and then 50 years from now, there's a new version of me running around. Like that bothers me. and I don't want my family to have to deal with that. More importantly, is what are the implications on my family in that regard? What happens if that clone decides that they want to go on some sort of rampage and the DNA evidence that gets collected points at me? Like that ain't cool. Maybe I watch too much sci-fi, but sci-fi does such a good job of pointing to where we are going as a society in the future that it's kind of
Sometimes
hard
it's
to ignore.
freaky. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, oh, so much there. Here's what I would say, specifically on the family side of it. What's tricky about it, right, is with genetic materials, not everybody who's involved is consenting to it. And that's why I really struggle about it, because
Yeah.
if I made a decision to, have my blood drawn and submit a sample or do a cheek swab, whatever it was, and I made that decision myself, and I was like, yeah, I read the privacy practices, I looked up the company, I felt good about it, then great. With genetic materials, though, right, if you have siblings, if you have parents, if you have like family members, blood relatives, the second that they've put their genetic materials in, and then especially on an ancestry map, if they're like, oh yeah, and my cousin's name is XYZ and my sister's name is this, we're all in it now. And at
Yep.
least a fraction of our genetic material is within the database. So without even me necessarily consenting to it, my genetic makeup could be in their database without me even noticing. And that's the part that really bothers me about this, because there's a consent portion of it that I just fundamentally disagree with, which again is a tricky part of this technology. It's inherently part of the innovation that society as a whole has decided to being like, hey, actually, like we've decided that we value that level of data over, your sister's privacy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're not great as a society generally when it comes to making decisions for other people's privacy. So I'll just leave my thoughts at that.
Well, and I mean, it's interesting because, I was we talked about hymns on a recent conference, and I was having a really incredible conversation with a French technologist out there. And I think y'all met, I'm not sure, but
Hmm.
anyways, he was talking about he builds robots and he's an innovator and is doing some really, really cool stuff with robots, which is amazing in hospital systems, like cutting edge innovation that like we would all hope to have in every single hospital one day, of making sure that it's easier for doctors to provide better care. Like we can
Yep.
all agree being like, if we all lived in a society where, every single hospital had the best of the best, we would all just be better off, I think. At least that's how I see the world. So, but he was complaining to me about being like, well, because, I live in the EU, I'm regulated differently. So I'm actually jealous of the lack of regulation in the US.
Hmm.
And I was like, ooh, as somebody who does this for a living, like, I hear you as a technologist. And I said this, I said, but as a citizen, I'm really happy for you that you have better regulations in place. And he was like, I completely agree with you. It makes my day job harder, but I feel
Hmm.
safer about my personal data when I go to the doctor.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
right. So, like, we can complain about regulations in the EU, like the GDPR, but at the end of the day, most of the citizens like it and they still see the value in it. And so I struggle where we are in the US where we both live, of just struggling with, you know, right now, I don't trust many systems for any of my information. I'm getting to the point that like I'm going like opposite. Like I'm ready to like start paying cash. Like I'm
Yeah.
going backwards. I'm like moving away from innovative technology that I normally would be like cutting edge, want to try all of it as a technologist. I'm rolling back being like, I could pay cash. Is this
Yeah.
establishment not cashless? Like,
Yeah.
I'm going
It
backwards.
There is a downside to move fast and break things, and I think we're starting to realize some of that. I do want to also point out the fact that we definitely are not journalists, because we didn't even start with talking about why we're having this conversation. So, Mila, why don't you maybe give us the quick rundown of 23andMe and kind of what's brought us to talking about all these things?
Okay. I'll try my best. But so 23andMe, right, is a genetic data company. It started as a revolutionary technology a while ago, I think, like pretty early.
2006.
Yeah, okay, 2006. And, you know, again, cutting edge technology, honestly, like ahead of their time. And I think the industry, the entire technology industry was like, you go do your thing, right? Like, I think they had really widespread support because, again, we could see the advantages of if this was done ethically, this could be incredible. And again, I still think the technology industry as a whole is still very much in the spirit of go build it, but think about it. And so this organization, again, had some issues. They've been very controversial. They've had a lot of negative press over the last couple of years. Even like before, like I think in 2018, there was a lot of press about border issues and whether or not, somebody like a company like 23andMe could potentially help, match immigrants that have been separated at the border. And then in 2023, they had a massive data breach.
Yeah.
And all of their data was leaked. And that was super disappointing because a company like that, and I'm speaking on my own opinion here, I was disappointed just because I was like, wow, like they had the means and the resources to have the best security tooling in place and just had a major weakness. Again, it could happen to the best of the best companies. We
Hmm.
also all need to be prepared that it's going to happen pretty much at every company. So any company that I work with and advise, it's not a matter of if we have a data breach, it's when. And you need
Yep.
to build your compliance security IT programs with that in mind. Your cybersecurity, cyber resiliency framework needs to be built with it will happen, not if it happens. And if you're still having conversations with C-level executives about if instead of when, I would strongly advise you to reconsider who you're working for.
Yeah, that gets to the whole concept of cyber resiliency, I think we talked about previously, where, yeah, it's good to have good defenses, but you got to know what you're going to do when those defenses fail, because you have to assume that they're going to fail, because if you can't react properly, and you don't prepare to react properly in that situation, it's very likely a company ending incident, which
is exactly what this case study is about.
I,
That's
I'm,
why
I'm not
it's
going to say exactly, but
so
yeah,
relevant.
there's
Well,
a pretty
again,
direct line there.
I will happily say the disclaimer: we are not flies on the wall within the board, and like like you will never know, and I don't need to know. I just, as a compliance practitioner, can say to being like, man, I'm really disappointed a company because it was all of their data, right? It wasn't just like it was unencrypted too. So, and then at that point, like once it's out, it's out. And so many companies have had really massive data breaches, especially in the last couple of years. We're just unfortunately like we're all just kind of used to it now. I think we've all gotten that letter at one point or another being like, shoot, your social security number or this or that or this. With
All too common.
yeah, and so like I think as a society we've all decided to be like, well, this just is. Which sucks. This is why the fight for privacy is not dead in my personal opinion. It's very active, but we've all just decided to being like, yeah, well, okay, like I've been breached. What I think sets the marker for me for companies that actually give a shit is how they respond to such an incident. Because again, there's something about understanding the reality of like, I don't know, I think there's something really humbling about seeing a massive tech company who, again, was trying to do something really good and made a mistake. Costly one, a very costly one. But something about we've seen other companies do this where then they've been like, we are so sorry, we didn't do enough. And like, we are going to invest everything we have to fix it to build back your trust.
Yeah.
And I kind of think that this is where they might have missed the mark.
I would definitely rather do business with, assuming two companies are going to get breached. I would much rather do business with the one that was like, okay, here's what we did. Here's where we screwed up. We want everybody to do better. So learn from our mistake. And now here's what we're going to do to improve it so that this doesn't happen again. And there are companies out there in the cybersecurity space that had multiple breaches like that, I gave them the benefit of the doubt on the first time around, but the second time around, I'm like, it's probably time to go at this point because clearly they aren't doing the things that they said they were going to do to properly protect this really critical data that I've
right.
entrusted them with.
And again, it all comes down to like your personal risk tolerance and also like what level of data are we talking about? Are we talking about like again, I'm really not trying to advocate for like any data breaches. Like there are things available to help companies like make sure this never happens to them. And it's why proactive compliance is so valuable and so important. But that's what I give a shit about. So like I care about that, and I'm sorry that I'm swearing so much. I'm fired up, but we try to keep this.
Milu's very excited about this topic.
I care a lot about compliance. It's my thing. So I would say if you're thinking about how to learn from the experience, because I really want to maybe pivot to because again, like I'm also not in the business of like shaming companies or anything like that, because like stuff happens. Like again, we have no clue what exactly happened that now they're like going bankrupt, but I don't love that I was like good riddance. Like that's not a fun feeling for them. I'm also just like, again, because they were such an innovator in this space, so like it's just like sad to see a startup just like crash and burn. And I think that's really what we're witnessing, and I think it's depressing because again, I think their intention, their mission, their ethos was really positive, and I do think we're losing out as in like consumers of that they're not going to be in the space anymore. But I am kind of like, ugh, like if you had maybe been a little bit more proactive about gaining your like customers' trust, because I think their reputational, like their brand damage was huge after the breach.
Yeah, which is what have led them to announcing that they're going to go bankrupt. To kind of finish the story there, and at this point, to me, it's the companies felt the effects of that breach of trust, and and their loss of reputation and all that kind of stuff has brought them to this point. To me, I don't applaud the company going under for one really big reason, which is when a company goes bankrupt like this, sometimes they can pull out and they can be their own company and continue to move forward as they were before in a more enlightened, removing debt type of way. Honestly, that's one part I haven't looked at for this story yet is what type of bankruptcy they're going into. But they
It's
have
Chapter 11.
okay, so restructuring. Their CEO
I'm gonna
has
go
left
double
the
check that.
company,
But
and so you're going to get new leadership in there that could potentially turn the ship around and improve things. So cautiously give the benefit of the doubt. To me, the biggest, scariest part now is that all that data that's in there that, granted, has leaked. We don't know how thoroughly it was leaked, or if it was every bit of data, or how fractured that data was. Tying it back together and stuff. But now we've got the complete whole system that somebody could come and get for pennies on the dollar. You may have some company that has interest in cloning human beings coming in like, well, there's no better treasure trove of data for us to do the thing we want to do. And they're maybe doing it for less than good reasons. And so they may be able to get this company for nothing and come up out of nowhere to gain this. And if they don't make a lot of noise, they'll disappear from our collective mindsets. And we may not even realize what happens with that data. That's what scares me about this situation and makes me not want to applaud a company that generally I haven't been a fan of, to be quite frank, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about.
yeah, and so, okay, just to the point, just for the clarification. So, according to their open letter to their 23andMe customers from their direct blog, it's that they took a step to enter into a voluntary Chapter 11 restructuring and sale process. So
Okay.
they're seeking a partner who shares our commitment to this is directly from the letter, so I'll read it here, but we will seek to find a partner who shares our commitment to customer data privacy and allows our mission on helping people access, understand, and benefit from the human genome to live on. So, again, and that sounds really good. And so just to clarify my comment on good riddance, because I 100% agree with you on the fact that I'm super concerned about what's now happening to the customer data that they have access to. And it is some of the most sensitive data that we could have ever envisioned. It's data that I don't even think we would have dreamed of when regulators passed HIPAA. I don't know if we would
Yeah.
have thought that genetic material was part of like HIPAA in the US. So I completely share your concern. I think it is a good case study for students, professionals, honestly, everybody. I think this is an important case to talk about, even just like with your neighbors, about being like, oh, like, are you, do you have your data? Because I would also be like, make sure you go delete it and like go get access to it. And I think it's a sad story. I'm disappointed by the whole thing. I think different decisions could have been made. And that's, again, purely speculative as somebody who just like cares about compliance.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those areas where a lot more will come out. And since we're so early in reporting this or discussing it based on reporting, we're not doing any reporting ourselves,
We are
other than
not
bringing our
reporters,
opinions.
clearly.
Yes. More will come out. And so I guess based on what we've seen, you mentioned HIPAA. Does HIPAA apply? Like, is HIPAA going to protect anybody in this scenario?
I am glad you asked. I think we're learning on this one together. So HIPAA really applies to covered entities and business associates. And so covered entities would be something like a hospital system, your doctor's office. It's the entity that's like directly covered by HIPAA is what you could think about it. So it's if you're a patient and you're going to the doctor, your doctor is the covered entity. The hospital system is the covered entity. If your doctor uses maybe like a medical processing technology or something like that, then that is called a business associate. And so basically business associates are also governed by HIPAA. The requirements are a little bit less strict because in theory, they don't have access to any personal health information. So as long as they don't have access to PHI, whether they're storing, accessing, processing it, whoever is, your medical bill provider is the perfect instance. Your insurance company is a great example.
Hmm.
For the most part, your insurance company, right, doesn't necessarily get access to your health information unless you give it to them, unless you specifically consent to that. So you as the patient. Then there's a bit of a caveat that we're reading as we're kind of diving into this particular case study where there are certain loopholes that technology companies can explore by potentially being excluded from HIPAA if they get direct consumer consent. So this is where privacy law comes in and basically is like, if I, as the individual user and consumer, not necessarily a patient, but I decided to voluntarily give my like my oral sample or blood draw to this technology company, they're not really a covered entity because they're not a hospital system. It's not necessarily the type of entity that was intended for HIPAA. Like, the regulators
Yeah.
didn't really think about this use case because also technology has advanced rapidly since the 90s.
Yeah. The mid-90s didn't have a lot of medical technology companies that were like 23andMe that were designed to do medical like things, but are more Silicon Valley, more technology companies. It's kind of like Tesla. Is Tesla a technology company or are they an automotive company?
Both.
That puts them in a weird position where they're not necessarily always going to be regulated like an automotive company, and maybe they're not. Not that there's a lot of regulation around tech companies, but
I feel like we're diverting.
we of course are diverting. So HIPAA may not always apply in a situation like this. So don't count on that protecting you by any stretch of the imagination, is what I'm hearing.
Well, it yeah, consumer
Don't
protections
assume.
do apply. So suddenly there are a lot of other protections like governed by the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, where suddenly consumer protection laws come into play. So it's not like they're unregulated. They just might not be regulated by HIPAA.
Yeah.
But again, as somebody who advises companies on this, it's not a stance I would necessarily recommend because it's really hard to argue that genetic materials aren't PHI.
Yeah.
So there's also something to be said about the company should also understand what rules apply to them. That's not the consumer's job. It's not the patient's job. It is the company's job to understand the laws that apply to them and also make appropriate defenses for each. So just because technically HIPAA might not apply here, I would be shocked to see that hold up in court. But again, who knows? It also depends like which court, what state,
Yeah.
there's so much going on right now. Um, I would say from a technology company perspective, I would always go be more risk averse on this one and probably like build your compliance programs around the strictest standards. And then amazing if it doesn't apply to you. Great. If
Yeah.
your legal and compliance teams are like, hey, no, actually too strict. That's only good news. It's not really a great approach if you're starting out and you're building like medical technology in this particular use case to suddenly be like, we don't think that this applies. It might not end well for you.
I think that's a good note to end on. It depends, and it may not end well for you. So you kind of touched on delete your data. Let's talk about what the fallout of this is to individuals. So if I have gone and sent my genetic material to 23andMe and they've decoded my DNA and they've got all of that information in a database somewhere, there's a lot of recommendations out there and a lot of write-ups on how do you delete your data. So I guess that's a first. Well, that's what a lot of people are talking about. Like, get your data out of there so that whoever comes along and buys it doesn't have access to that information. To me, there's a step before that, which is get your own data out of there. Like, make sure you have your data. You paid for that data to be generated. Grab that data, download it. We were talking about this before we started recording, and it sounds like there's some level of portability around your genetic makeup, your DNA tests, that you could potentially take it to other places and utilize that data. So that data could still be useful. Good.
Also, one of the positive things that actually 23andMe did actually after their large data breach was they actually made sure that they gave consumers way more access to their data than they normally had. And so that was actually one of the lessons learned that the company did that actually showed me that I was like, oh, wow, this is good faith in what they're doing to taking this seriously, of making sure that they're like, hey, you know what, like, we want to give you heightened access. I do think that that was coming from the regulators that were involved with the breach. So, again, whether it's proactive or retroactive doesn't really matter. At least like consumers were getting additional access to their genetic materials. And it has to be for data portability requirements, specifically in California, and like New York and Colorado and some other ones are pretty strict on this. But basically, data portability means that you can export your data and upload it into a competitor. That's really like kind of the dumbed down version of it, of basically saying like, I can download my data in a way that as a consumer, it's in a file structure that works on my computer. I don't have to have like some fancy computer that I don't have access to. It needs to be in like PDF or an Excel spreadsheet or like a Word document or something that like general consumers have access to. And then it needs to be able to be stored locally, like within their own machine. It can't be like held up in the provider's cloud storage or anything like that. It needs to be exportable. So like consumer needs to be able to be like, I would like a copy of my data. And then the company needs to be like, okay, sure. And they have to try to make it easy for you to do that. And that is actually protected even under US law, which is huge. And I do think we looked it up. I do think some of the other players in the market do accept the data.
Yeah, that seemed to be a bit of patchwork, and that's kind of the thing with download your data from these types of sites where they're containing your data. You know, same thing with Facebook. You can download your data and then delete your account, and it's cool because like all those pictures you uploaded and stuff are in that download, but there's nowhere for me to use that data. Like I can't go to
It's
MySpace and
unstructured.
upload it. Well, not so much that it's unstructured per se, but more that it's not in a format that's portable. And so that's where I really honed in on, okay, I can take that data and download it, and somebody else can, some other site that does similar things to 23andMe can then process that and do things with that data. It may not be 100% what they would have if they did the testing themselves, but if they have some sort of way to visualize that or to do a search across for some sort of genetic marker.
I would advise review the privacy practices before you just like upload
Oh,
your genetic materials into like another database. Because like we're just
read all that terminology.
extending
Don't.
the issue. This is like there's certain things, right? Actually read the privacy notice, like things that like are the most sensitive things to you. I think PHI is a really great thing, like at your doctor's office, the dentist, whatever. Like actually like one, they're supposed to give you a copy of the privacy practices. So like when you sign up as a new patient, and I think on like an annual basis or at least every once in a while. So
Yeah, you've got
read it.
to re-sign all the HIPAA stuff.
This is like the one, like certain things for me that I like actually care about. And I say that as somebody who reads almost every privacy notice because I find them interesting.
Always looking for a better way to do it,
Because I'm a
and I
nerd,
love that.
but I'm a compliance nerd. So I will
Yeah.
say I just want to just like wrap up and talk through what are the steps, right? So again, I would act like if you have an account, it's definitely the time to just go ahead, like log in. I would download a copy of your data locally onto your computer. I would probably also reset your password after you've done that. Just like go ahead and do a little password reset.
And make sure that data that you download is in a secure place. Make sure you secure it
Yes,
in some way.
I was getting to that. But yes,
Okay.
100% needs to be super secure. Um, so I would just like step one, just like download a copy of your data locally. Maybe like turn off your backups for a second, just like, you know, download it locally onto your computer. I wouldn't automatically upload it into your cloud storage just for right now. I would download it locally. I would open the file, make sure you can read it. Just open the file, make sure it actually like isn't corrupted, right? Because it'd be really annoying if in 2 years you were like, oh, it was zipped and I can't unzip it. Like make sure you can actually like open whatever they've sent you. Then I would go into your account, I would probably like reset, and then I would follow the steps to just like deleting your account and making sure they erase your materials. So there's always two steps on this. It's one step is like delete my data, the next step is delete my account. And then from there, I would then think through, where do you want to store this information? Do you want to print this out and store it like physically, locally in your home under lock and key somewhere, like in a safe or in your, wherever you have your most sensitive records? This actually might be a good thing to do there, because like something could come up and later on in your like medical journey that you might be like, oh wait, it could be in that file. So I might actually advise you to print this one, but print it, but don't leave it out. Don't use a public printer. And then, even as I'm explaining this, it's so exhausting. Protecting our personal data these days, it's so tiring. So like, I get why we're all like not great about it, because it's extra administrative work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another wrinkle that I think of because of my background is if I delete it off of their system. And I know GDPR has some regulations around this, but I don't know what the situation is in the US around backups. Do they have to go to backups? Do they have to delete every single copy they may have that they've created over the years? Or does that just delete the production one?
Oh, that's a whole other episode in itself.
And I didn't expect you to actually have an answer, to be honest.
I do have an answer. It's not one you're going to want to hear.
As I figured.
Most likely not. So yes, they will still always retain a copy because they legally have to. So, backups and customer data, if it goes to litigation, which it wouldn't surprise me if 23andMe is already in litigation or whatever, like if there's a class action lawsuit out of the data breach, for example, then they legally are required to hold on to it for 6 to 7 years under like other legal regulations in the US. And that's coming from like a documentation retention basis. So
legal hold.
100%. So, but in their active database, they won't have it. So it would be a little bit more challenging. But then again, and hopefully, I hope they really invested in some of the best security tools to making sure that their archives are impenetrable. But and then if you do want to upload it into cloud storage, if you want redundancy, right? We've talked about that too. So you have your local copy, whether that's, maybe on a local hard drive, a USB. This sounds like a good thing to actually have a USB and then put it in a safe deposit box, whatever. Otherwise, from there, if you want redundancy, so you want a secondary copy, that's what we're talking about. If you have, you have your export of your file on your USB stick and you want it somewhere else, then cloud storage is a good option. Just make sure you're mindful of who you're using for your cloud storage. And then also make sure you've got really good passwords in place and two-factor authentication turn on.
Of course.
There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of steps.
And some of those are just default things. Like, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. You should generally turn on the multi-factor authentication. You should generally store things in a encrypted format if you can. Not always the most consumer-friendly.
Data hygiene. Love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all your digital photos, like, don't just rely on Facebook to store those for you forever. Cool. Okay,
let's end on that. I feel like that was a little bit like a negative spin, but anyways.
Actionable things. So things for people to go do.
We want to socialize on current events with you. So please, we appreciate you listening to us and also learning with us as we were literally reading articles as we were recording today. So, we're trying our best here. We appreciate you all that asked, though. Thank you so much for the friends of the podcast of actually reaching out and being like, hey, like, Lou, Brian, what do you think about this? Because we'd actually love to hear your take on it, which is such a compliment.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it helps with ideas of pushing shows. It shows us what you're interested in. So we appreciate that level of interaction and would definitely encourage it going forward.
All right, we'll keep it up. Keep asking us keep challenging us, I guess, is actually how I'm going to... This was a challenge for both of us. Keep challenging us.
I don't mind it.
We do.
Don't mind a challenge.
Current events.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll talk to you on the next episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.